Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Time Saving on Irrigation and Landscaping with Vacs and Drills, brought to you by Landscape Management Magazine and our sponsor of the event, Ditch Witch. Before we get started, I want to let you know that for today's webinar will be recorded. You are currently in a listen-only mode. A recording of this webinar will be posted to landscapemanagement.net/webinars and will also be emailed to you tomorrow. At this time, I'd like to acquaint you with the ways in which you can participate during today's presentation. Please notice the Q&A panel at the left side of your console. If you have a question, type it into the panel's text box, then click Submit to place your question in queue. We encourage you to ask and answer any questions you may have for our speakers during the presentation. We will address these questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A portion. Questions submitted during registration have already gone to our panelists and may be covered during today's presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties during today's event, you may use the same Q&A panel on your screen to submit your issue, and assistant producer Danielle Pesta, moderator Aurora Harris, or I will personally assist you. You may learn about our speakers by viewing their photo, bio, and email address in the panel located on the upper left-hand side of your console. If you are logged into your social media accounts, you can share the webinar's title, description, and URL with your friends and colleagues using the Share This widget you'll see in the bottom left corner of the screen. Finally, at the bottom of the right console, you will find a PDF of today's presentation slides, which you can download, and a link to visit the Ditch Witch website. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to today's moderator, content marketing producer for Landscape Management, Aurora Harris.
Thank you, Joey, and welcome everyone to today's webinar on how to save time on landscaping and irrigation. Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Today we will be hearing from Cory Maker, Product Manager for Horizontal Directional Drilling of Ditch Witch. We will also be hearing from Chapman Hancock, Product Manager for Vacuum Excavation at Ditch Witch. At this time, I'll turn the presentation over to you, Cory. Take it away.
All right, thank you guys for the introduction. And again, talking through this a little bit, we're extremely excited to talk through the landscape industry and how these pieces of equipment apply to this. But obviously realizing in some of the equipment we showed on this slide is showing the traditional types of methods, processes that people utilize today. But looking at the overall market as it is and how the directional drilling industry and how the vacuum excavation industry can play into this as well. And just how these are typically used on some of these job sites. And we also laid out some images throughout this presentation to see in situations where it would be a necessity to have something like this. Basically utilizing these methods as less invasive opportunities to go do a job without, damaging the turf, landscape, things like that.
Yeah, and another thing we'll speak to, Cory, is the traditional equipment and how it's currently used and how the market is taking advantage of its capabilities, such as the mini skid loaders, plows, and some other methods. But the mini skid steers have a lot of versatility in them. They can go to many different job sites to perform many different functions. And so we'll talk through how that pairs with drills and vacuum excavators as well, and how vacuum excavators and drills, very similar to the equipment shown on this slide, are not only standalone pieces of equipment that can go perform jobs and create business, but also how they're complementary to these traditional methods. And then also briefly touch on how having vacuum excavators and HDD units in your fleet can also help diversify the bids that you can go submit.
So talking about directional drilling and what it is, so horizontal directional drilling, in a lot of cases, whether it's utilities, other things like that, allow you to have a lot different outlook on what the overall job site could look like from start to finish. But obviously being much less invasive than any type of open cutting that we would see today, even whether it's the fiber industry or things like that. But that's kind of how it factors into this landscape industry, is the opportunity it gives you to leave things completely functional, whether it be roads, golf courses, high traffic areas such as corporation, things like that, working in front of office buildings, without having to shut something down. And talking about the overall history of HDD, we actually just celebrated the 50-year anniversary of directional drilling, just to give you an idea of how long that industry's been going. And that's another thing with this is the amount of infrastructure, things that are in the ground today. When you start talking about residential homes and areas like that when you're working in landscaping, is just dealing with that overall level of quantity of infrastructure that's in the ground today and working around that. In most cases where you can't even open cut without having, situations where you're having to work around other products that are in the ground as well. But as far as typical uses, the use case for something like a directional drill is very vast as far as the overall market, from oil, gas, the telecommunications markets, things like that. But again, there's very specialized markets in the water segment with irrigation to home drops, things like that, that kind of led people to use these in a much different manner than what they're originally indicated for, 50 plus years ago. And the technology and accuracy of grade bores, things like that, has also helped it develop around the technology on the locating, tracking side of it as well. That just makes it that much more accurate to pinpoint exactly what type of work you can do with this.
Yeah, and Cory, just for some background context to the picture on the slide there, that's actually one of our drills on a job site where the homeowner in this situation had a established road. It had been there for 3 to 5 years. It's a gravel road, so you can imagine they had to pack it down, put multiple layers of gravel on it to establish that good roadway. And they had an area across that roadway that they wanted irrigation to go to. I believe it was some kind of field, a soccer field / baseball field for the kids to go play and just mess around on, but they wanted to irrigate it. And the only way to get from the house to this field was across the road, and they didn't want to tear up the road, because when they went back and started thinking about it, if they trenched the road up, that would cause a speed bump, if you will, in the roadway, and could potentially cost thousands of dollars in rock and gravel and everything else being brought back out and pack it back down. So they decided to go ahead and hire out a drill to come in and put in a water line under the road. This is another good example of how, in this situation, the drill really complemented the piece of equipment out there, because you can't see it from the picture, but from behind that drill, they actually trenched about 150 feet from the wellhead to this entry pit. They bored across the road, and as they were pulling in product and finishing up on the drill side, they went ahead and trenched in the irrigation lines on the other side and tied in all at the same time. So just an example of how drills can be complementary on the job site.
And I think that's a prime example of whenever directional drilling is being looked at in this type of industry, is making sure that whenever you look at this from a bid aspect, that, in cases where it's feasible to use directional drillings, whenever, to Chapman's point, essentially looking at what you can do open cut, because the price differential between the two, being that HDD is extremely specialized market when it comes down to people operating them and actually being able to use them properly. But making sure that when you go through that bid spec analysis of breaking that down, that you actually utilize it in the correct applications to make it much more feasible.
Right, yeah, and I know we'll talk about that in just a second, Cory, but as you mentioned, it's important to not only explain to the customer the bid, but also the afterthought, the after piece, the after rehabilitation of that road and the cost of that. And that's really what the homeowner saw in this situation, was going to be more cost effective to bring in this drill. So on the vacuum excavation side, what is vacuum excavation? Vacuum excavation is essentially just for simple terms, a shop vac and a power washer all in one unit, if you will. It's a high performance vacuum on a power pack that also has a power washer, or an enhanced power washer, if you will, for excavation. So you're using high pressure water to excavate, and you're using the vacuum to pull that slurry out into the debris tank. Vacuum excavation really started back in the 1800s into the early 1900s, really in the hydro excavation portion of this. In the picture there down in the bottom left, where hydro was used for mining applications, or just large excavation where they'd put up big pumps, big water, and they just let it flow out and excavate down. It was a real fast way for mining to excavate down to what they needed to do. That kind of transitioned into the grain world where it was how do we move material, and then they found that they can actually kind of reverse the system in a way so that they can actually use it for excavation and removal of debris. The picture in the top there is just kind of an example of what one may come across when installing an irrigation line at an existing facility, whether that's a commercial. This picture is actually in a commercial application. I believe this is at a school where some irrigation needed to be installed out front. They were putting in some new irrigation lines to help with the lawn and keep everything good. You can imagine at a already existing building, the infrastructure is going to be there to support it, whether that's the sewer laterals, the gas lines, electric, fiber. And so hydro excavation can be used to dig that trench in a safe method so that you're not damaging the utilities that are already in the ground. And that's another way that vacuum excavators are really used today. So that soft excavation piece there, vacuum excavators are going out and exposing utilities, whether it's a big excavator digging a trench or if it's a drilling in a new product, whether it's telecom or gas. That vacuum excavator is going out there exposing the utility so that anytime a utility is being put in and crosses that utility, you can see it and you know that a safe installation has occurred without damage to that existing utility. There's a couple other methods where vacs do that for mapping infrastructure and other ways. But in the irrigation world, we see vacuum excavators dig what we call slot trenches, while the traditional trencher is putting in the mainline irrigation system. The vacuum excavator would be digging this slot trench right here where you see existing infrastructure in the ground so that the product can be sleeved underneath it and your pop-outs can be put in without damage to existing utilities or having to cut off existing utilities to prevent service to a building.
Well, and with that too, and seeing some of these pictures on here makes some of this stand out even more when Chapman talks through the overall vacuum excavation side of this. But just the level of accuracy of work you can do with vacuum excavation, especially when you're talking the rehab side of going through, for instance, the golf course, something like that, where you're going out and actually doing this, not having an excavator on the job site compared to some type of vacuum excavation, you actually leave a much less invasive footprint on that job site whenever you're doing this type of work and able to go back and backfill it with the new product and basically put sod down and make it a much cleaner process overall. But I mean, you can see the level of accuracy in that top right picture that you can do with that, as well as laying out, some type of plan ahead of time without having to actually get down to that and not have to worry about damaging other things that are around whatever that rehab may possibly be.
Yeah, absolutely, Cory. We'll get into some other examples with those examples of installation and point repairs and other things like that.
So talking about the HD side of this, so looking at the complementary equipment, and when we start talking about some of these job sites, and when I say specialized regarding directional drilling in some of these applications, it's very obvious that whenever you're in situations like we mentioned earlier a little bit, talking about golf courses, instead of open cutting some of this stuff, you can imagine being able to go in and put some of this rehab work in while a golf course is fully operational during the day, basically having a less invasive process of doing this, but also mitigating the risk of whatever damage you could possibly do to that landscape going into it. But it diversifies what you could do on that job site today. And I think when we start talking through this from a landscape and irrigation side of this is where understanding that industry, something that has really came up in the last couple of years is how we develop and design around some of this with the smaller equipment. Realizing that decibel ratings and even things like that factor into what can be on some of these job sites. But also seeing that, whether or not it's situations where they can truly shut something down, whether that's a road like Chapman was talking to in that first photo of directional drilling, was the fact that, these are situations where you can leave roads, golf courses, residential areas, places of business completely open and operational, because of the fact of it being less invasive on those job sites.
Yeah, and that's, the sensitive areas and those restricted spaces really come into play. And I know We've got a lot of different scenarios where that comes in, and we'll talk through the vac side of that here in just a minute as well. But, you know, as you get into these environments where up against houses or up against buildings and being able to install stuff and utilize hydro excavation for that can be helpful.
So talking through this a little bit, and I mentioned this earlier regarding, you know, setting up that job spec as to what it is and what section could possibly lay out to basically directional drilling. Going into that, the bore planning side of that, understanding where the drill be positioned, start to finish, entry, exit pits, that type of information. Whether or not you wind up white lining, again, this is something that even every piece of OEM equipment provided to the market today has some type of 811 sticker on it as a reminder. But also realizing how on these job sites, once you get out there, you know, we talked about the infrastructure that's in the ground today, but making sure those locates are done. And in most cases of a directional drill job site, you're going to have some type of vacuum excavator on that job site anyways, whether it's the application Chapman was talking about earlier with stitch boring, but also daylighting and potholing those utilities as you cross them to guarantee basically a safe passage through there, knowing that you didn't damage any other utilities in the ground that day. But also understanding what appropriate space looks like. And this is something that from an overall directional drill atmosphere today, is there's so many different avenues of training and understanding what that is, whether that's online training or even other institutes out there providing a type of technical service today. But realizing that a lot of this work from a general contractor standpoint would be broken out into different subs that would do work like this. But we've seen more contractors in the irrigation industry start moving in this direction and self-perform because they see the opportunity there to diversify their business as well. So this is one of the bigger factors in this industry whenever we start talking about directional drilling and landscape and overall just what you could actually do with it. But the biggest thing for some of these job sites is space. And you talk about whether that's a residential area. Technology has really driven the overall size and footprint and performance of these rigs down to even smaller sizes than they were in the past as far as overall performance. One of the biggest things with going in and deciding what you're going to do is when you start looking at these overall bids and the jobs that you're going to be doing is the type and size of product that you'll be putting in the ground throughout that, as well as the soil conditions that you could run into. And that's one thing, working with a dealer network will help benefit you from that, from the standpoint of they understand the terrain, the equipment that's been sold in that territory, and help you decide what that's going to be. But also the horsepower requirements behind that. Again, a lot of these landscaping irrigation jobs are very short drill shots as far as overall footage, and it's not usually a very large product that they're putting back in the ground. So utilizing anywhere from a JT5 to a JT20 to do this type of work is very common in the industry today. But the overall layout of that could definitely play into what you need overall, but also realizing when we talk about diversifying the portfolio of a business around doing, whether it's landscape irrigation, but also realizing the other driving factors in this industry, that whenever maybe the possibility of that work life cycle being something that, you know, whether they dive into the fiber industry and look at telecommunications, things like that, it just gives them that overall opportunity once they get into that industry to start to basically spread that out.
Cory, I know you talked about the footprint expectations a little bit there. So when we're looking at the footprint of the drill and how we need to spec that out, can we simply just say, well, the length is this, and we want a couple of feet all the way around it? What else? And then I know sometimes you'll need fluid mixers and other things on the job site. Does that have to be right next to you, or can you park that somewhere else and string line? How does that work?
And that's a good question. As far as the industry goes, that's something that is very driven by the overall job sites. Today in this under 20K class, generally you see a directional drill that's paired with a trailer that has a fluid mixer with anywhere from 300 to 500 gallons on board. That is operational at very great distances at this point. A lot of these job sites that you'll wind up on, especially in residential areas, you'll have to run a fire hose connection from the fluid mixer back around to the directional drill. But again, it makes it much more feasible in those applications. But anywhere, you talk about a directional drill in these size classes range anywhere from just under 13,000 pounds down to about 7,000 pounds. So that's another big factor into deciding what type of equipment you can have on these job sites, and base around that is the overall footprint that you would have from a construction equipment standpoint on these job sites. When you look at whether it's the drill, the fluid mixer, whether or not there's going to be a vac on that job site, and those other requirements as well.
Yeah, good point, Cory. Thanks.
So this is an HDD use case, and we kind of want to put some of these images out there to give you an idea. When you look at the golf course installation, and a lot of that's new installation of a pre-existing golf course that you would see it feasible. The development of a golf course from ground up, honestly, looking at it from that aspect, is generally going to be something open cut, lower cost options up front. The use case for a golf course would be the rehabilitation of a pre-existing irrigation system that they're going to go back and replace without shutting the golf course down, essentially, and being able to use directional drilling in as much as possible during a situation like that to basically leave it as much as less invasive as possible, but knowing that there will be some of that will be open cut, and as Chapman said earlier, stitch board in to replace some of that. The residential communities, and this is a pretty good picture as far as lays out how something like this could be done. And when you start talking about roads, parking lots, things like that you don't want to have to dig up and shut things down, is again one of those situations where directional drilling is a much less invasive option that allow you to get in and do this work without actually having to shut much of it down. And then again, talking through just some of this overall process and realizing that it may be a small percentage of the work that's actually being done on some of these job sites to where sometimes it could be the majority, but effectively pricing that out and bidding it for this is kind of what makes it more feasible and not feasible in situations, but also realizing that there are a lot of people out there that could be basically subbed to do this work as well.
Yeah, and Cory, I know we've run into several contractors who've performed work at golf courses where the golf course is looking at the cost of installing a new line to an existing fairway or up to the green, and that open cut definitely comes in a little bit underpriced. But what also has to be looked at, not only for the contractor doing the work, because a lot of times that contractor is responsible for getting the fairway or the landscape back to its original state, but also the golf course and making sure they understand the long-term repercussions of what type of work they're performing. So we've ran into courses before where they were wanting to put a couple of new irrigation systems or new points onto a fairway. They had some irrigation issues there. They needed additional water, and they were looking at it, and they were going to have to shut down this hole. And so they're trying to figure out, well, how do we want to bypass this hole? What do we need to do? Do we just shut everything down? What do we want to do? And we had a contractor come in with a drill and basically brought a trencher, a drill, and a vac on site and said, well, I'll set up out here in the rough. I mean, your main line is in the rough anyway, kind of your easement. So I'm going to set up back there. We'll dig an entry pit. We'll put barricades up, make sure everyone knows we're there. We'll stay out of the way. We'll try to maintain, golf course etiquette. But they were able to keep the course open and still perform the work. So they didn't have to shut down the hole. They didn't have to shut down the whole course. And they were able to get that irrigation system in. And then I believe towards the end of the day, when kind of golf was settling down, they went out and actually put the sprinkler heads in, tied everything in, and they were in and out within a day with little damage to the course. So that's just one example of how golf courses can utilize drills and install irrigation systems. And then, the residential areas, when we think about residential areas, whether it's, apartment complexes, high-profile residential areas, a lot of them have security gates, right? And so the picture up there in the top right is depicting an entry point into a residential area where they needed to get irrigation from one side of the road to that, and without cutting up the road or stopping traffic, they were able to bore underneath, dig down, connect their water line, and provide irrigation to that. We've also seen them utilize that for other methods as well, such as telecommunication lines, water and sewer as well. So that's another example. And anytime you have to cross a creek, I mean that picture in the bottom left is a really beautiful picture of a natural landscape on a golf course and how that plays in. directional drilling is a really good opportunity to go from one side to the other without disturbing the natural habitat when it comes to some of this stuff. And so that's where we see a lot of this stuff used. And here in just a second, we'll talk more on the vac side and how it plays into this. But in most of these cases, vacs are on site as well, whether that's digging the entry pit or going out there and actually pulling the plug for the new irrigation point to go in on that fairway. So when we talk about vacuum excavation and kind of some of the best practices, you know, we've looked through that golf course installation and what that means for us. You know, in any situation, we always want to call 811, and you know that 811 process can start when you're bidding the job. So when you go out to that job and you're wanting to know where the utilities are, go ahead and call 811, do your white line, make sure 811 knows where to locate. You're able to show up, bid the job, understand the opportunities to go around existing utilities, or understand at least where those utilities are so you can better plan that job. And then as you perform the job, again, if that paint, you know, in the landscape and irrigation world, that grass, especially in the summertime, it's growing, it's being mowed, that paint will fade over time. And so it's always good to have fresh paint on the ground. So make sure you call 811 before you perform work as well. Know where that stuff is in the ground. Nozzle selection, as we're working through hydro excavation and how we're picking what we want to do and what the best practices are, is that flat versus rotating nozzles. So that flat nozzle is going to be like your typical power washer car wash nozzle. It's just what it says. It's a fan nozzle at a certain degree, and you can vary those degrees. However, those are good for cleaning. They're not necessarily good for excavation for a couple of reasons. One, the fan nozzle stays in one spot, whereas a rotating nozzle actually rotates, the water stream rotates as it comes out. And that's important for a couple of reasons. We want to make sure that that water is always in a different area. So we're moving that digging lance around as well as the nozzle rotating. What that does for us is it mitigates that water being focused on one point for a long period of time. It also helps us excavate. So that water is always hitting something new as you're going around. You're not excavating the same thing. And then the suction tube you see there and the guy on the right is holding, that's important to keep the water and the debris out of whatever you're excavating. As you can imagine, that water is very efficient when it comes to excavating soil conditions, and can be efficient if you don't clean it out properly. However, if you don't have the water in that slurry pulled out of the hole you're excavating, that water is just having to travel through another media. So you're losing efficiency, you're losing power and pressure. So we always want to make sure that it's clean. And then most important, you always need to see where you're digging. And so that way you know if you're exposing a utility or if there may be one in the area, you can see what you're excavating and where everything's at. Pressure selection, 3,000 PSI or less. So that really is many industry studies have been done on that. And when you look at 3,000 PSI compared to an example of 4,000 PSI, the production, the excavation rate increases slightly with 4,000 PSI, but the opportunity to damage an existing utility greatly goes up. So that 3,000 PSI or less is really where we want to be. You can increase GPM, so the flow rate of what you're excavating. And as you can imagine, the more flow rate you have to it, to a point is good so that you're able to flush that slurry out and create a slurry for the vacuum to pull out. Another thing to keep in mind as we're looking at the best practices, and we'll get into this more when it comes to selecting a vac, is that air excavation versus hydro excavation. So we just talked about hydro excavation utilizing high pressure water. Air excavation is exactly what it sounds like. It's utilizing high pressure air to excavate. You're still using the vacuum system to pull the debris out, but air excavation can be utilized in many scenarios where we're going to excavate something and need to put what we just excavated back in the hole. Dry material can be placed back into the hole that was just exposed, whereas wet material, of course, can't. And so air is really good for being able to pull that dirt or that soil out of the hole either put the sprinkler head in or visualize where that existing utility is and then put it back in. And the reason that's really beneficial is, one, it does minimize what you have to haul away from that job site. But two, and most importantly in the irrigation and landscape world, is that soil has the same properties that you just pulled out, because it is the soil you just pulled out. So it has the same compaction, has the same nutrition. So when you're excavating that out, you know the grass is going to grow about the same way. You know it's going to compact in the same way that the soil did in that area before. And it just allows you to better understand how it's going to react when you put it back. Do you need to mound it up? How much do you have to mound it up? And what do you expect it to do after installation? And then again, it's very important. Always keep that digging lance moving, and then that's just what we talked about before. Is the reason we want to keep it moving around is just so we're not focusing on one point for a long period of time. We want to keep it moving, not only for damage mitigation but also for productivity. So the more area you're covering, the more productive and efficient you are. So we look at the vac use cases. We talked about exposing utilities and how that's beneficial on this site. A couple of examples of doing that and how vacs can be complementary pieces of equipment as well as standalone business models is, for example, had a contractor who was putting in an irrigation line it was a new home, but all of the utilities had already been hooked up. The irrigation system was decided kind of later in the process. The homeowner decided they wanted that installed, and so they brought a mini skid loader with a trenching attachment as well as a bucket, and I think a power rake was on there as well. And then they had the vac there, and they had the vac there for a couple of reasons. They knew that there was existing utilities there. They knew about where the sewer, the private lateral was, but didn't know exactly where it was, but they knew they were going to have to cross it. So they did a slot trench along that area, along the intended path for the irrigation to go in, just to ensure that they knew where it was and that they didn't expose that when they were putting the irrigation system in. Then they had the trencher going in and putting in the longer trench areas and then the stems off the main line for the irrigation. And they were able to get that done quickly. And then they also utilized the vac. I thought was very unique situation and very, very thoughtful on how they utilized it. But when they got up against the house, the homeowner had gone ahead and plumbed for an irrigation system to be put in, and it went in where the main line went into the house. So rather than use the trencher to try to dig down and expose this, they knew the existing water line was already there, as well as the stub out for the irrigation system. So they actually brought the vac and just parked it on the driveway and pulled the vacuum excavation hose around, the suction hose, as well as the water hose, then dug next to the house and created it was about a 4x4 box so that they could tie in. And then they just used the vac to go ahead and trench out to where the trencher had already dug the line in, got everything hooked up, and filled everything back in. So it was a really good example of that. Another thing that we briefly hit on was those point repairs, and that picture in the top right, vac can be very helpful when it comes to irrigation point repairs. As you know, most irrigation lines have water in them, and if you have a break, it's going to have water in it, whether it's still flowing and you catch it, so you turn the water off, or it's continued to flow for a couple of days, it's a muddy mess. The vac can actually get there, it can excavate down to the point that's broken, that needs repair, and it can also clean that area out. So you can pull all the water that's coming out of that pipe out of your way, so you have a nice dry environment to fix that and do the point repair, and then cover it back up. Also works great for the sprinkler heads too, just excavating around the sprinkler head. That allows you to expose the point where you need to replace it without impacting the pipe below. So when you're digging with the shovel, you're not bending that pipe going up to the sprinkler head, so you're not breaking anything at that joint or damaging the pipe below, and then you end up having a much bigger repair than what was intended. And then that bottom right picture is just an example of the easements in today's world. The easements are the same size, but more product is going into it. And one of the reasons I put that up there is because in a lot of residential areas, easements are a part of the homeowner's backyard in some way. The product is going in there. Some homeowners will go ahead and fence in that easement, and then if there's a gas meter or other meters back there, they'll actually do landscaping to kind of hide that. So it's important to know where those are, and it's also important just to understand where that vac can become very helpful in exposing that or working in and around that. Another thing that's not depicted here, but vacs are also really good in the landscape area where, for example, mulch beds. Mulch beds, they decompose, become good soil, but over time, as you add mulch, the depth or the height of that mulch bed grows. And so at some point, you got to go in there and clean it out, get back down to a good level of ground, and put new mulch down. So vacs can actually go in with the suction tool, pull the old mulch out without interfering with any of the existing vegetation, and then you can go back in and spread mulch back around the vegetation without damaging anything that's already existing. So that's another really good example of kind of how they're used and some of those examples. And I think Cory touched on it a second ago about the diverse areas that drills play in, and vacs are the same way. When you add a vac or a drill to your fleet, Cory, you're really not only diversifying what you can do in your traditional work, but you're broadening what you can do. I know you've got a couple of examples of that.
Well, and it goes back to the point when we talk about diversification of this type of construction equipment, it's one thing. But honestly, looking at this from the directional drill side of the business, we got into this business as some type of drill support years ago as that functionality, and didn't take us very long to figure out that the customer use case for this was much broader than we ever imagined. And from the product line that we offer today of just fluid excavation, but also the mud vacs to go along with the drills, to Chapman's point, the things that we've seen people use this thing for has definitely diversified their overall business. Whenever you start talking to the directional drilling side of this and where this can be used, I think the picture in the bottom right depicts that a lot. I mean, we talk about what's in the ground and what can't be cut, open cut, no matter what it is. And the overall technology that I talked to earlier, of the accuracy of directional drilling has actually made this a lot more feasible as well. With the technology being able to do higher end grade bores instead of having to open cut and lay things like that as well. But just the sheer overall less invasiveness of both of these methods for an application like that, but also making sure that when you go out and bid this type of work that you're bidding the performance side of that as well, even down to the point where Chapman was talking about using the vacuum excavation equipment for doing something like, whether it's a garden, things like that, that is much less invasive and way faster overall operation than what you would think. But even the point repairs where Chapman was talking about, if you can imagine an irrigation line that's been leaking for weeks, that you find that, trying to get an excavator out there even close enough to it, and then overall damage you could do to that landscape at that point, instead of just running a hose and walking two people out there with a wand and a suction hose, would be much less invasive on that job site. So just making sure you understand the overall use case of both sides of the equipment will make it much more feasible in those situations, and just make sure you're bidding out the jobs correctly.
Yeah, and Cory, I know this last year we've all felt the pandemic and how that's affected all of us, and really as business owners and contractors out there, kind of in some level scared us a little bit. Is the work going to still come? How are we going to do this? And I think for a lot of us, we were very fortunate and were able to keep going. But where we've really, really heard the positives come back from landscapers having vacs and drills on site as well is they may not use that vac every day or that drill every day, but they do know that there is other work that can be done. So, it helps them, one, expand their business opportunities if they want to diversify and grow, but it also just allows them to know that vac can always be busy. It's always going to be bringing in money. The ROI on it's good. If it's not working today, I can have it go support my friend who's a driller on the mud side, or he can go do some mapping contract for the local city. So it's just another way to ensure work is always coming in, and also gives ways to grow.
Well, and I think that's one big example, and we talked through this a little bit as far as the use case of what these are, but also in this industry realizing that some people don't specialize this, and being able to understand where they could benefit from this type of work, and whether that is bringing in a sub to help with something like this would be a bigger part of that, and understanding what its true capabilities are. So just keeping that in mind, whether it is you self-performing this work or getting the sub to help with whatever that instance may be, through the use cases we've talked about today, but also realizing that reaching out to our dealer network will also allow you to get visibility of what that equipment is, how it functions, and how even people in your area today are utilizing it.
Yeah. So when we're choosing the right vac for the job, what kind of work we're doing, what's the soil conditions, and all of that really plays into it. And, as Cory mentioned when we were talking about selecting a drill, just like everything else, performance comes with investment. So the more performance you get, a little bit more investment will take to get there as well. So really, how often are you using it? Is this something you expect to use every day? Is this something you expect to use moderately, or is this going to be on the site every day working 10 hours a day? And when it comes to that, a higher horsepower, higher blower performance is going to be something you want for efficiency gains so that you can get to the site, perform the work, and move on to the next one. And that's really another way how vacs can complement existing equipment or traditional equipment. You can have trenchers on site and the vac showing up and performing the work where it needs to, and then moving to the next job. So as we're looking at that, the types of soil conditions, is it hard soil conditions where you need a little bit more water flow, more water pressure to be able to excavate more efficiently? Do you need a gas, which is a little bit lower horsepower, less performance, versus the diesel? It's going to be on site every day. You expect to keep it for 5+ years. Those are things that we need to think about. And then the vacuum specs. So the higher the CFM, which is cubic feet per minute, the higher that CFM, the more pull you're going to have. But also there's going to be a spec on there called inches of mercury. And that lift is how strong that vacuum is. So when you think about CFM and inches of mercury, CFM is how fast you can lift the weight, and inches of mercury is how much weight you can lift. So that's kind of how you want to view those two specs. And then your water system also is another thing where we want to keep in mind that 3,000 PSI is going to be fairly consistent throughout the industry. So as we increase pressure or mainly flow, that flow rate's going to help you excavate a little bit quicker, can help you in harder soil conditions. The flow rate will definitely help out with that as you're providing more flow to harder soil formations, which allows you to excavate a little bit more efficiently. And then that air again, do you need air on site? Are you in conditions? Air is a really good tool, as we talked about earlier, for being able to put soil back in, but it's also limited in some areas. A hard, compact clay is not air's best friend when it comes to performance. So whether you're utilizing air in some of these soil conditions or not, it's always a really good idea to have water on board as well. In most cases, you can excavate with air, finish up the job real quick in a hard soil formation with water, and still have a deemed dry material in the tank to dump back out because you use just a little bit of water. So those are just some of the things that we want to think about when we're choosing the right vac. The trailer size, what kind of truck do you have? Are you going to have to invest in a larger truck, more capacity to tow a trailer? We do offer everything from non-CDL all the way up to 26,000-pound trailers. So definitely a lot of options and things you can look at. Definitely want to take a look at your local regulations when it comes to the trailers. And I know a lot of you are familiar with trailers as you probably utilize them in your day-to-day work anyway. So just something to keep thinking and keep in mind as well. And, as Cory mentioned earlier, if you're working in an area or you're utilizing equipment that you haven't worked around before, always a great idea to stop by your local Ditch Witch dealer. They're the experts in that territory. They know the ground conditions. They know what tooling to use on drills. They know what reamers to utilize. They are the experts in that area. They can help you pick out the vac, and in most cases, they'll be there and more than happy to help demo. And then also, if it is something new, Ditch Witch dealers are great at providing training. We have online training that you can go look at for both drills and vacs and mini skids as well. But also that Ditch Witch dealer is very familiar with our equipment and can provide you and your crew the proper training to run it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things when we talk about this being a specialized industry, that's something that stands out. And we're seeing more and more people come to us for training no matter what type of our industry we play in today. But on the directional drilling side, I mean, this is something we've even developed a VR simulator for, those training applications, so people can come in and actually see what this is and honestly learn what directional drilling is, not from the overall operation, but actually seeing what's going on downhole when you're functioning the piece of equipment and just getting a general understanding of that as well. But that's also helped people understand what's going on and getting into this industry and just what it takes overall. But I think that's the biggest aspect of that is like Chapman said, using those subject matter experts in those areas to help you develop and diversify your business.
Yeah, thank you, Cory. And with that, that concludes our portion of the presentation, or we'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you both. That was great. So at this time, we're going to jump into some questions we received during registration and a couple we got during the presentation. So the first question, are the drills and vacs compatible with all Ditch Witch machines?
So when we say compatible, yes. So everything that we develop, I mean, in most cases, looking at, depending on whatever industry they're working in, they're designed to work around underground applications. So in short answer, yes. Across the board, when you start looking at that, we talked about a job site today that a directional drill would be on, that's kind of our thing of owning that job site and making sure that no matter whether it's a trencher all the way down to the fluid mixer for the directional drill, the vacs, all of that are compatible with one another.
Yeah, and that really plays into how they're complementary pieces of equipment where whether it's the plow or the dedicated trencher or the mini skid steer, the stand-on skid loaders, all of those are complementary to each other on these job sites with drills and vacs. And vacs are utilized on drill sites for excavating the entry and exit pits, mud support. They're utilized for exposing utilities while crossing, or the trenchers going up to them and the vacs providing the rest of that work. So, yeah, not only on the Ditch Witch side of things, but also other equipment as well. It's a very good asset, and they work well together.
Okay, great. And then we'll do one final question now before wrapping up today's event. So the next question is, what are some challenges when doing this type of work?
So I think the biggest challenge with this, I mean, say, for instance, if you were fully operational and you were getting into doing this, when you get into the overall aspect of directional drilling, that some of the challenges you'll run into are trying to find the correct opportunities that this would fit for, whatever niche it may be for the landscape or irrigation. And we talked through a lot of those use cases today. But the overall challenges that I would see with this and some of the things we deal with, whether it's following the best practices that we went through a little bit today, that's something we continue to do constantly as presentations regarding that around directional drilling, locating, the vacuum excavation side of that, daylighting, potholing, ensuring that all those are done properly is probably the biggest thing. And making sure that that's not necessarily an industry standard, but making sure people are following those. Like I said, every situation is a little bit different regarding how you would utilize this equipment on those job sites. But again, making sure that you can find skilled operators is where you determine whether or not you can actually have this as a self-perform type job, or if you're out there looking for subs to do this type of work for you in the landscape industry.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Cory. I'm sure we've all felt the impacts of the workforce in the last couple of years and job turnover and having to train new employees on how to work this stuff. And it can be difficult to be responsible for all that. And again, that's where kind of leaning back on that Ditch Witch dealer to help provide training. But as an OEM, we really take that to heart and we try to focus on how we can help in those situations. And we talked briefly about the training, the online training, and then the training support that the Ditch Witch dealers have. But another thing that we've really tried to focus on, when we look at equipment, we really take in customer feedback, and that's how we develop new products. We really try to get out there and listen to what the challenges are that our customers are feeling. And one of the things we've done to try to help with the turnover and the training aspect is that common controls. And, Cory mentioned the VR simulator for the drills. Being able to sit on that or operate any drill and go to the next one and understand how to operate it and be familiar with the controls is huge when it comes to the operator and the skilled labor, and we do that on the vacs as well. So whether you're using one of our 20 horsepower vacs or our 75 horsepower vacs, the controls are the same spot. They do the same function. You turn it on the same way. You dump the tank the same way. Everything's very familiar. They'll know how to use it by using any of ours. And so that's one way we try to combat some of that training and skilled labor.
And I think to that point, I think if you're a landscaping or irrigation contractor today, hearing those use cases that we talked about, if you can look back over your last 5 years of jobs and applications and instances where you could have used this, not having to shut a road down, not having to shut a golf course or a residential area down, the benefit you could see from that, and until you actually get to understand how these pieces of equipment operate and what they do. When we say specialized, I mean, it's not necessarily that it's specialized. It's just not as common in this type of industry as it is in the oil, gas, sewer, fiber, telecom type work. But so many different areas where if this type of operation was used, would have simplified their overall work and may have cost more up front, but had less risk mitigation towards the end of that project, having to worry about the reinstatement of everything that was damaged throughout that overall operation.
Thank you, Cory and Chapman, for sharing these insights with us today. We are going to wrap up now. First, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. We appreciate your time. Now, Joey has a few closing remarks for us.
Thanks, Aurora, and thanks again to our speakers and all of you for attending today's webinar. Time Saving on Irrigation and Landscaping with Vacs and Drills, brought to you by Landscape Management Magazine and our sponsor of the event, Ditch Witch. If you have any additional questions for Aurora or our speakers, you can reach out to us directly via the email addresses you see on this slide. The Resources panel houses a PDF of today's presentation slides, which you can download. To access this panel, click the green icon at the far right end of the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. A recording of this webinar will be emailed to you tomorrow and posted to landscapemanagement.net/webinars. Upcoming webinars from Landscape Management also will be posted to that page. Thank you all for attending again, and we hope you'll join us again for another great webinar.